There is a mystery that dwells in the depths of human nature, a riddle as old as consciousness itself. Watch the desperate soul who claws at power like a drowning man, grasps at driftwood. See how it slips away, how the very force of his grasping repels what he most desires. Now turn your gaze to another figure, one who stands in the shadows of your awareness, who moves through the world with an authority so quiet it whispers rather than shouts, yet commands mountains to bow. This is the great paradox that haunts the corridors of the psyche. Those who hunger for dominion find themselves forever famished, while others, without conscious intention, without the ego's desperate scheming, become the center around which others naturally orbit. They are the still point in a turning world, the magnetic north to which all compasses swing. What is this invisible dominance that flows through certain beings like an underground river? It is not the brittle tyranny of the inflated ego, not the hollow posturing of the persona desperately seeking validation. No, this is something far more ancient, far more profound. It emerges from the deepest wells of authentic being, from that sacred marriage between consciousness and the unconscious that Jung called individuation. Picture, if you will, a mountain. Does it strain to prove its height? Does it shout its grandeur to the valleys below? The mountain simply is, and in that pure being, it commands the reverence of all who behold it. So too with the quietly dominant soul. They have touched something primordial within themselves, something that needs no external validation because it draws its authority from the well of being itself. This authority springs not from the ego's inflation but from what the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, the great turning inward that transforms base metal into gold. These individuals have undergone a death of sorts, a symbolic crucifixion of the small self upon the cross of consciousness. From this death comes rebirth, not as the person they thought they should be, but as who they truly are beneath all masks and pretenses. In the theater of human relations, most of us wear personas, those carefully crafted masks that Jung recognized as both necessary and limiting. We perform our identities, adjusting our faces to meet the faces that we meet, exhausting ourselves in the endless choreography of social acceptance. But there are those who have grown weary of this performance, who have dared to remove the mask and stand naked before the mirror of their own souls. This nakedness, this radical authenticity carries a power that the persona can never match, for in choosing to be themselves rather than what others expect them to be, they tap into what Jung called the self. With a capital S, that archetypal center of the personality that transcends ego consciousness. This self does not grasp for power, it is power in its purest form. The quietly dominant have learned the great secret that the ego spends a lifetime trying to avoid. That true strength comes not from controlling others, but from surrendering control of themselves to something larger. They have died to the small self, and been reborn as conduits for archetypal energies that flow through them like electricity through a clear conductor. Watch them in a room full of people. Notice how conversations naturally turn toward them, how others unconsciously seek their approval or guidance. This is not because they demand attention. Indeed, they often seem to be paying attention to something invisible to the rest of us. It is because they have become what the mystics called a hollow bone, empty of ego's debris. They provide a clear channel for wisdom to flow through. Their dominance operates in the realm of the numinous, that quality Rudolf Otto described as the mysterium tremendum, the awesome and fascinating mystery that both attracts and repels us. Others sense in their presence something that cannot be named, but cannot be ignored. It is as if they carry within their aura a fragment of the eternal, a whisper of that vast intelligence that moves the stars and governs the tides. This invisible authority manifests in ways both subtle and profound. In moments of crisis when lesser souls fragment and scatter, these individuals become the eye of the hurricane, perfectly still while chaos whirls around them. Others, sensing this stability, naturally gravitate toward them for shelter and guidance. Leadership is not something they seek. It is thrust upon them by others who recognize their capacity to hold the center when the center cannot hold. The psychological mechanism at work here is what Jung called the constellation of archetypes. When someone embodies authentic power, not the ego's counterfeit, but the real article, they activate in others the ancient patterns of king and subject, wise one and seeker, parent and child. These archetypal energies exist in the collective unconscious of our species, waiting to be triggered by the right stimulus. But here lies the deepest irony. The more one strives to activate these archetypal responses in others, the more elusive they become. It is only when striving ceases, when the ego's agenda dissolves into something larger, that true presence emerges. This is the great enantiodromia, Jung's term for the tendency of things to transform into their opposites. By releasing the need to dominate, one becomes naturally dominant. By ceasing to grasp for power, one finds it flowing through them like water through a riverbed. The journey to this effortless authority is neither quick nor easy. It requires what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the descent into the underworld of one's own psyche. One must face the shadow, that repository of all we have rejected about ourselves. One must confront the anima, or animus, those contrasexual aspects of the psyche that carry our unlived potentials. One must suffer the dissolution of all familiar identities and emerge, phoenix-like, from the ashes of who they thought they were. This process cannot be faked or accelerated through technique. It is initiated by life itself, through loss, betrayal, failure, illness, or any of the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. These crises serve as invitations to go deeper, to question the foundations upon which the ego has built its house of cards. Those who accept the invitation and follow it to its depths often emerge transformed, carrying within them a gravity that others unconsciously recognize and respect. Their authority is like the authority of water, soft yet irresistible, yielding yet ultimately triumphant over the hardest stone. They lead not by commanding but by attracting, not by pushing but by creating a vacuum that others rush to fill. Their silence speaks louder than others' words, their presence more influential than others' actions. In a world increasingly filled with noise and pretense, with the hollow ring of manufactured authenticity and performed vulnerability, the quietly dominant represent something precious and rare. They are the keepers of an ancient flame, guardians of a way of being that our souls remember even when our minds have forgotten. They remind us that true power is not something we can possess, but something we can become. It is not a tool to be wielded, but a state to be embodied. It flows, not from the ego's inflation, but from the self's integration, not from what we add to ourselves, but from what we have the courage to remove. This is the beginning of our journey into the heart of authentic presence, a journey that will take us through the landscapes of shadow and light, chaos and order, death and rebirth. For to understand the quietly dominant, we must understand the great work of individuation itself, that lifelong process by which the personality grows into wholeness and the individual becomes who they were always meant to be. Like seeds that must first die in darkness before they can reach toward light, we too must descend into the depths of our own being, if we would emerge as sovereign souls. The mountain does not become itself by trying to be a mountain. It simply allows the forces of creation to do their work through geological time and patient pressure. So too must we learn to trust the deeper currents of our own becoming, even when they carry us into territories unmapped by conscious intention. The paradox of effortless authority awaits those brave enough to release their grip on the small self and surrender to the larger self that seeks expression through them. In this surrender lies not defeat, but victory, not diminishment, but enlargement, not the end of power, but its beginning in its truest and most magnificent form. For in the end, the quietly dominant have discovered the great secret hidden in plain sight, that we do not need to become powerful, we need only remember that we already are. In the ancient wisdom traditions, there exists a teaching about the still point, that motionless center around which all movement revolves, the eye of being itself, where chaos transforms into cosmos. T.S. Eliot glimpsed this truth when he wrote of the still point of the turning world, that place where time and eternity intersect, where the dance of existence finds its eternal rhythm. This is where true dominance begins, not in the conquest of others, but in the mastery of one's own inner landscape. To understand centered presence, we must first descend into the geography of the psyche itself. Jung taught us that consciousness is but the tip of an iceberg, beneath which lies the vast unconscious realm that truly governs our lives. Most souls drift upon the surface of this ocean, tossed by every wave of circumstance, blown by every wind of opinion. But there are those who have learned to dive deeper, to find that still place beneath the storm, where all is silence, all is peace. This descent is the first movement in the alchemy of centered presence. It requires what the mystics called kenosis, a radical emptying of the ego's agenda, a willingness to release the familiar coordinates by which we have navigated our existence. For the ego, this feels like death itself. It clings to its constructed identity like a shipwrecked sailor to debris, terrified that to let go means annihilation. But here lies the great paradox of psychological transformation. What the ego experiences as death, the self experiences as birth. As we release our grip on who we think we should be, we create space for who we actually are to emerge. This is not the dissolution of personality, but its crystallization around a deeper center, not the loss of self, but the discovery of self. Picture a violin string when it is perfectly tuned. It resonates with pure tone. Too loose, and it produces only flaccid noise. Too tight, and it snaps under pressure. The string must find that perfect tension, that precise relationship between holding and releasing, between structure and flow. So too with consciousness, centered presence emerges when we discover the exact balance between effort and surrender, between conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. The alchemists understood this process intimately. They spoke of the prima materia, the first matter, the raw substance that must be refined through repeated processes of solution and coagulation, dissolution and crystallization. In psychological terms, this prima materia is our unprocessed emotional and instinctual energy, the chaos of unintegrated experience that swirls within the unconscious like storm clouds pregnant with lightning. The work of centering begins with what Jung called the withdrawal of projections, the difficult process of recognizing that what we see in others is often a mirror of what we cannot yet see in ourselves. When we are triggered by another's behavior, when we find ourselves reacting with disproportionate emotion, we are being offered a gift wrapped in the paper of discomfort, the opportunity to reclaim split-off parts of our own psyche. Watch the uncentered soul in action. How they scatter their energy like seeds on barren ground, how they react rather than respond, how they give their power away to every passing circumstance. They live at the mercy of what Jung called the personal unconscious, that repository of repressed memories, forgotten traumas and unlived potentials that exerts its influence from the shadows of awareness. But the soul committed to centering learns to dialogue with these unconscious contents rather than be possessed by them. They develop what Jung termed active imagination, the capacity to engage consciously with the images, symbols, and emotions that arise from the depths. Through this engagement, what was once autonomous and threatening becomes integrated and allied. This is the true alchemy, not the transformation of base metal into gold, but the transformation of unconscious suffering into conscious wisdom. Each emotional reaction becomes raw material for insight. Each trigger becomes a teacher. Each wound becomes a doorway to wholeness. The centered presence that emerges from this work carries a quality that others immediately recognize, though they may struggle to name it. It is the quality of gravitational pull, not the desperate magnetism of neediness, but the natural attraction of psychological mass. Just as planets orbit the sun not because it commands them to, but because its very being creates the gravitational field that organizes their movement, so too does centered presence create an organizing field in the realm of human relations. This field operates below the threshold of ordinary consciousness, in what Jung called the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche we all share, populated by archetypal images and primordial patterns. When someone embodies genuine centeredness, They activate in others what might be called the axis mundi archetype, the image of the world tree, the sacred mountain, the cosmic pillar around which all existence revolves. But this centering cannot be achieved through mere technique or willpower. The ego, ever eager to co-opt spiritual practices for its own aggrandizement, often attempts to manufacture presence through meditation, affirmation, or positive thinking. While these practices may have value, they can also become subtle forms of spiritual materialism, ways of avoiding the real work of psychological transformation. True centering requires what the Dark Knight mystics understood, a willingness to encounter what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. This is that inevitable phase of the individuation process where all familiar landmarks disappear, where the ego's carefully constructed sense of identity undergoes radical dissolution. It is here, in this place of not knowing, that authentic presence begins to crystallize. The dark night serves a crucial function in the alchemy of consciousness. It strips away the false supports upon which the ego has built its house, revealing the bedrock of being that lies beneath all constructed identity. This bedrock, what Jung called the self, is not something we create, but something we discover. It has always been there, waiting beneath the accumulated sediment of conditioning and expectation. The emergence from this dark night brings with it a quality of presence that cannot be counterfeited. It carries the authority of one who has died and been reborn, who has descended to the underworld and returned with treasure. This is not the brittle confidence of the untested ego, but the quiet certainty of one who has touched the eternal and found it living within their own depths. This centered presence manifests as what we might call conscious non-resistance, the capacity to meet whatever arises without the immediate impulse to change, fix, or flee. It is the presence of the oak tree that bends with the storm without breaking, that gives way to the wind while remaining rooted in the earth. This flexibility is not weakness, but the highest strength, the strength of water that ultimately wears away the hardest stone through patient, persistent contact. In interpersonal dynamics, this quality of presence creates what Jung called a temenos, a sacred space where transformation can occur. Others sense this containment and find themselves able to relax defenses they didn't even know they were carrying. In the presence of genuine centeredness, the false becomes uncomfortable and the authentic feels safe to emerge. The centered individual has learned to hold what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty, mystery and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. They have developed comfort with paradox, with the both and rather than the either or. This comfort with contradiction allows them to hold space for others' complexity without trying to resolve or fix it. Their influence operates through what might be called morphic resonance, the mysterious way that coherent patterns tend to replicate themselves across space and time. Just as a tuning fork causes other tuning forks of the same frequency to vibrate in sympathy, centered presence tends to evoke centeredness in others, not through teaching or preaching, but through simple being. This is why the truly dominant need not grasp for control. They have become control in its most refined form, not the crude control of the tyrant who rules through fear, but the elegant control of the maestro who guides the symphony through presence and timing. They have learned that the highest leadership is not the imposition of will, but the creation of conditions in which others' highest potentials can naturally unfold. The ripple effects of this presence extend far beyond immediate personal interactions. Like a stone thrown into still water, centered consciousness creates expanding circles of influence that touch shores invisible to the conscious mind. The mother who finds her center affects not only her children but generations yet unborn. The teacher who embodies authentic presence shapes souls in ways that reverberate through decades. The leader who has found their still point creates order that extends far beyond their immediate sphere of influence. Yet, this influence is never coercive, never manipulative. It operates through what Lao Tzu called Wu Wei effortless action, the doing that is not doing. It is the influence of the sun, which does not force the flower to bloom, but simply provides the conditions under which blooming naturally occurs. The journey to this centered presence is unique for each soul, yet it follows certain universal patterns that Jung mapped in his study of individuation. There must be a call to adventure, some disruption of the ego's comfortable sleep that initiates the descent into the unconscious. There must be an encounter with the shadow, those disowned aspects of ourselves that we have projected onto others. There must be a dark night, a period of dissolution, where familiar identity structures break down, and there must be a return, an integration of conscious and unconscious that births a new center of gravity within the personality. This new center operates not from the narrow confines of ego consciousness, but from what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to generate new possibilities through the creative tension between opposites. The centered individual has learned to live from this transcendent function, to allow solutions to emerge from depths beyond rational calculation. In the end, the alchemy of centered presence reveals itself as the fundamental work of human existence, the gradual incarnation of the eternal into time, the slow embodiment of archetypal wisdom in individual form. Each soul who achieves this centering becomes a living demonstration that domination and submission are not the only possibilities in human relations, that there exists a third way, a middle path, where power flows not through conquest but through presence, not through force, but through the irresistible attraction of authentic being. This is the true gold that the alchemists sought, not metallic wealth, but the transformation of leaden consciousness into the golden presence that needs no external validation, because it has found its source in the inexhaustible well of being itself. In the deepest chambers of the human psyche dwells a figure that most would rather not acknowledge, a dark twin, a rejected brother, a disowned sister who carries all the qualities we have deemed unacceptable in ourselves. Jung named this figure the shadow, and recognized it as perhaps the most crucial element in the process of becoming whole. For it is here, in our relationship with our own darkness, that the difference between authentic dominance and mere ego inflation reveals itself most clearly. The ordinary soul lives in terror of their shadow, spending tremendous energy keeping it locked away in the basement of consciousness. They project its contents onto others, seeing in external enemies the very qualities they refuse to acknowledge within themselves. The politician rails against corruption while harboring secret ambitions. The moralist condemns vice while wrestling with private temptations. The peaceful person attacks aggression wherever they find it, blind to the warrior energy churning in their own depths. But there are those rare individuals who have dared to turn toward their darkness, to descend into the underworld of their own rejected aspects and return not as victims but as allies of their own completeness. These are the ones who dominate quietly, for they have made peace with the very energies that others flee from or deny. In doing so, they have accessed a wholeness that others unconsciously recognize and defer to, not because they fear these individuals, but because they sense in them the integration they themselves lack. This integration of the shadow is perhaps the most demanding work the psyche can undertake. It requires what Jung called the transcendence of opposites, not the elimination of one pole in favor of another, but the conscious holding of both in creative tension. The shadow, you see, is not simply evil or destructive. It is the repository of unlived life, untapped potential, disowned strength. It contains not only our capacity for cruelty, but also our capacity for fierce love, not only our destructive impulses, but also our creative fire. Consider the shadow as a figure from mythology, not the cartoon devil with horns and pitchfork, but something far more complex and nuanced. Think of the trickster gods found in every culture, Loki of the Norse, Hermes of the Greeks, Coyote of Native American lore. These figures are neither purely good nor purely evil. They are agents of transformation, bringers of chaos that ultimately serves evolution, disruptors of stagnant order, who force new possibilities into being. The shadow operates by similar principles. It holds our repressed vitality, our denied authenticity, our unlived wildness. When we reject it completely, we become what Jung called two good saccharine personalities, lacking depth, edge, or genuine power. But when we integrate it consciously, we gain access to energies that can transform not only ourselves, but everyone around us. This integration requires what the alchemists called the conjunction oppositorum, the marriage of opposites. It is a sacred wedding between the conscious personality we have cultivated and the unconscious energies we have rejected. Like any marriage, it cannot be forced or rushed. It requires courtship, patience, and most importantly, the willingness to see the other as more than enemy or obstacle. The process begins with what Jung termed shadow work, the careful, methodical exploration of our own dark territories. This is archaeological work of the soul, excavating the buried aspects of personality that were lost in the process of socialization. For we are not born divided against ourselves. The shadow is created through the thousand small rejections of childhood. Each time we learned that certain aspects of our nature were unacceptable to those whose love we needed to survive. Don't be angry, we were told, and so we buried our righteous rage. Don't be selfish, they warned, and so we lost touch with healthy self-care. Don't be different, they insisted, and so we sacrificed our unique gifts on the altar of belonging. Each rejected quality descended into the unconscious, where it continued to live and grow in darkness, becoming increasingly primitive and autonomous the longer it remained unacknowledged. But here lies the great paradox of shadow work. What we resist persists, and what we embrace transforms. When we finally turn toward our darkness with curiosity rather than condemnation, we discover that the monster we feared is often a wounded child, crying out for recognition and integration. The rage we buried carries within it our capacity for passionate advocacy. The selfishness we denied contains the seeds of healthy boundaries and self-respect. The quietly dominant have learned to dialogue with their shadow rather than be possessed by it. They have developed what Jung called the function of consciousness, the ability to maintain awareness, even when difficult emotions and impulses arise. They do not act out their shadow contents unconsciously upon others, nor do they repress them until they explode in destructive ways. Instead, they hold them in conscious tension, allowing the energy to transform into more refined expressions. This conscious holding creates what we might call integrated fierceness, a quality that others immediately recognize as authentic power. It is not the brittle aggression of the insecure ego, nor the passive-aggressive manipulation of the repressed shadow. It is the clean, clear energy of someone who knows their own depths and is not afraid of them. Like a well-forged sword, they have been tempered by fire and emerged both flexible and strong. In interpersonal dynamics, this integration manifests as an uncanny ability to remain centered in the face of others' projections. When someone attempts to hook them with criticism, manipulation, or attack, they do not react from the wounded ego or the defensive shadow. Instead, they respond from a place of wholeness that can acknowledge difficult truths without being devastated by them, that can set boundaries without attacking, that can say no without guilt or explanation. This capacity creates a kind of psychological aikido, the martial art that uses the attacker's own force against them, not through violence but through skilled redirection. The integrated individual does not meet hostility with hostility, nor do they collapse into victim consciousness. They maintain their center while allowing others' projections to flow around them like water around a stone. The shadow's gifts reveal themselves most clearly in moments of crisis, when ordinary social niceties break down and raw survival energies come to the fore. While others fragment under pressure, the shadow-integrated soul finds additional reserves of strength precisely because they have made allies of energies that others must fight against. The aggression they have consciously integrated becomes fierce protection for themselves and others. The darkness they have befriended becomes the ability to navigate chaos without losing their way. This integration also carries profound implications for moral development. The person who has never acknowledged their capacity for evil remains dangerously naive, susceptible to acting out their shadow in unconscious and destructive ways. History is littered with examples of those who, believing themselves purely good, perpetrated the greatest atrocities. The integrated individual, having faced their own potential for darkness, develops what we might call conscious ethics, morality based not on repression but on choice, not on innocence but on experience. They understand that the line between good and evil runs not between groups of people, but through the heart of every individual. Having acknowledged their own capacity for cruelty, they become genuine and compassionate toward others' failings. Having faced their own temptations, they develop humility rather than self-righteousness. This humility, paradoxically, makes them more trustworthy leaders, for others sense that they will not be judged or condemned for their own human frailties. The shadow's integration also awakens what Jung called the inferior function, that least developed aspect of personality that often carries tremendous creative potential. The thinking type discovers the wisdom of feeling. The intuitive learns the value of practical sensation. The extrovert finds richness in introversion. This integration of the inferior function adds depth and complexity to personality, making the individual less predictable and more interesting. But perhaps most importantly, shadow integration breaks the cycle of unconscious projection that poisons so many human relationships. When we own our darkness, we stop seeing it exclusively in others. When we acknowledge our capacity for deception, we become less paranoid about others' motives. When we integrate our aggression, we stop attracting or creating conflicts as the only way to experience this disowned energy. This liberation from projection creates space for genuine relationship, not the collision of mutual projections that passes for intimacy in most human connections, but authentic meeting between two whole beings. Others sense this possibility in the shadow-integrated person and find themselves able to drop their own masks and defenses in response. The process of shadow integration is never complete. It is a lifelong journey of discovery and assimilation. Each new life phase, each fresh challenge, each deeper relationship reveals new aspects of the shadow that require conscious attention. But those who have begun this work develop what we might call shadow literacy, the ability to recognize and work with unconscious contents as they arise. They learn to read the language of symptoms, understanding that their sudden irritation may be pointing toward a boundary that needs attention, that their judgments of others may be revealing their own disowned qualities, that their dreams and fantasies are offering guidance from the unconscious. This literacy allows them to navigate the depths of their own psyche with increasing skill and confidence. The transformation that occurs through shadow work is alchemical in the truest sense. What was once poison becomes medicine. What was once enemy becomes ally. What was once source of shame becomes reservoir of strength. The individual who emerges from this process carries within them a quality of wholeness that others unconsciously recognize as authentic authority. This is not the authority of the ego that must constantly prove itself, but the authority of the self that includes and transcends ego consciousness. It is the authority of the wounded healer who has descended into their own underworld and returned with gifts for the tribe. It is the authority of the initiated one who has faced the guardian at the threshold and been deemed worthy to pass. In the end, the shadow's integrated wisdom reveals itself as one of the most powerful sources of quiet dominance available to human consciousness. For in making peace with our own darkness, we become capable of holding space for others' darkness as well. In integrating our own rejected aspects, we become whole enough to support others in their own journey toward wholeness. This is the deeper meaning of the ancient Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. What we integrate within ourselves creates ripple effects that extend far beyond our personal sphere. The individual who has made peace with their shadow becomes a force for integration in the collective, helping to heal the very splits and projections that create so much suffering in human relations. They become what Jung called a symbol of the self, a living demonstration that wholeness is possible, that light and dark can coexist consciously, that power can be exercised with wisdom and restraint. In a world torn by unconscious projections and shadow boxing with imaginary enemies, they stand as beacons of what integrated humanity might look like, not perfect but complete, not innocent but conscious, not dominating through force, but naturally dominant through the irresistible authority of authentic wholeness. In the ancient world, temples were not merely buildings but sacred geographies where the divine and human realms intersected. Each temple had its clearly marked boundaries, outer courts, where all could enter, inner sanctums reserved for the initiated, and holy of holies where only the high priest might tread. These were not arbitrary restrictions, but acknowledgements of different levels of consciousness, different capacities for holding sacred energy. So too, in the realm of human psychology, the quietly dominant have learned to create what we might call psychic temples, sacred spaces of the self, with clearly defined precincts that honor both intimacy and autonomy. This art of sacred boundaries represents one of the most sophisticated achievements of individuation. It requires the delicate balance between openness and protection, between vulnerability and strength, between giving and receiving. Most souls err on one side or the other, either becoming so open that they lose themselves in others' needs and projections, or so defended that they live in isolation behind walls of their own construction. But there exists a third way, a middle path where boundaries become not barriers but membranes permeable to authentic connection, while filtering out that which does not serve the soul's true purposes. The development of sacred boundaries begins with what Jung called the differentiation of consciousness, the gradual process by which we learn to distinguish between self and other, between our authentic feelings and those we have absorbed from our environment, between our genuine needs and the expectations that others have projected onto us. This differentiation is perhaps the most fundamental task of psychological development, yet it is one that many never fully accomplish. Watch the individual with poor boundaries, how they take on others' emotions as if they were their own, how they exhaust themselves trying to manage others' feelings, how they say yes when they mean no and give when they have nothing left to offer. They live in a state of chronic overwhelm, forever confused about where they end and others begin. Their energy leaks away like water through a cracked vessel, leaving them depleted and resentful. At the other extreme stands the over-defended soul, armored against life itself. They have learned to protect themselves through rigid walls that keep out not only pain but also joy, not only threat but also opportunity. Their boundaries are not membranes but fortifications, designed more for warfare than for living. They dominate through distance, through the creation of fear rather than respect, through isolation rather than genuine authority. But the quietly dominant have discovered something far more elegant, the creation of what we might call energetic sovereignty. Their boundaries are not imposed from without but arise organically from within, like the natural shape that water takes when it finds its proper container. These boundaries communicate themselves through presence rather than words, through being rather than doing. Others sense them immediately and naturally respect them, not because they fear consequences, but because they recognize something sacred that deserves reverence. This energetic sovereignty emerges from deep self-knowledge, the kind of intimate familiarity with one's own psychic landscape that can only be achieved through years of inner work. The quietly dominant know their own rhythms, their own capacities, their own sacred no's and enthusiastic yeses. They have learned to distinguish between the voice of authentic intuition and the chatter of conditioned response. This self-knowledge creates an inner compass that guides boundary setting with precision and grace. The process of developing sacred boundaries requires what Jung called the integration of the anima and animus, those contrasexual aspects of the psyche that mediate our relationship to both inner and outer worlds. The anima, Jung's term for the feminine aspect in men, governs receptivity, intuition, and the capacity for relationship. The animus, the masculine aspect in women, governs direction, discrimination, and the capacity for focused action. When these archetypal energies are integrated, they create what we might call conscious androgyny, the ability to be both receptive and directive, both open and discerning, both yielding and firm as circumstances require. This integration manifests as an uncanny ability to calibrate response to situation. In the presence of authentic need, the quietly dominant become infinitely generous, offering not just their resources but their very presence as medicine for others' wounds. But when faced with manipulation, entitlement, or energy vampirism, they become impermeable, reflecting back to others the very energies they are projecting without absorbing or reacting to them. Their boundaries operate like the semi-permeable membranes of living cells, allowing nutrients to pass through while screening out toxins. This selective permeability requires tremendous sophistication of discernment, the ability to sense not just what others are saying but what they are energetically transmitting, not just their conscious intentions but their unconscious agendas. The development of this discernment is itself a form of initiation. It requires multiple encounters with those who would exploit, manipulate, or drain our energy. Each such encounter offers an opportunity to refine our capacity for recognition, to notice earlier the subtle signs that indicate someone's approach to relationship is fundamentally extractive, rather than reciprocal. These experiences, painful as they may be, serve as teachers in the university of boundaries. The quietly dominant have learned to read what we might call the energetic signatures of different types of approach. They can sense the difference between someone who seeks genuine connection and someone who seeks validation, between someone who offers authentic presence and someone who performs intimacy for their own agenda. This sensing happens below the threshold of rational analysis, in the realm of what Jung called the feeling function, that non-rational but highly intelligent way of evaluating the qualitative aspects of experience. Their response to these different energetic signatures is swift and sure, like the immune system's recognition and response to foreign substances. But unlike the harsh rejection of a purely defensive stance, their boundaries carry what we might call compassionate firmness, the quality of saying no to behavior while maintaining love for the person exhibiting it. They understand that others' boundary violations often stem from their own woundedness, their own lack of healthy modeling, their own desperate hunger for connection. This compassionate firmness creates a strange paradox. By being less available to inappropriate demands, they become more genuinely helpful to those in real need. By refusing to enable others' unconscious patterns, they create space for those patterns to be seen and potentially transformed. By maintaining their own energetic integrity, they model for others what such integrity looks like and invite them into greater authenticity themselves. The establishment of sacred boundaries also requires what Jung called the transcendence of the helper complex, that unconscious identification with the role of rescuer, savior, or perpetual giver, that often masks deeper issues of self-worth and control. Many souls become addicted to being needed, to being the solution to others' problems, to being indispensable in others' lives, but this apparent generosity often carries a hidden agenda, the unconscious demand for gratitude, appreciation, or emotional dependency in return. The quietly dominant have released this need to be needed. They offer their gifts freely but without attachment to how those gifts are received or used. They help when their help is genuinely appropriate, but refuse to rescue others from consequences that might serve their growth. This detachment is not coldness but wisdom, the recognition that true love sometimes requires allowing others to struggle with their own challenges, rather than depriving them of opportunities for development. Their boundaries extend beyond the interpersonal realm into every aspect of their lives. They have learned to say no to opportunities that don't align with their deeper purposes, to commitments that would scatter their energy, to relationships that demand more than they nourish. This selectivity is not selfishness but stewardship, the careful tending of their own resources so that they can offer their best to what matters most. The creation of sacred boundaries also involves what we might call temporal sovereignty, the claiming of their own time as sacred territory. The quietly dominant do not allow others' urgencies to automatically become their emergencies. They have learned to distinguish between genuine crisis and manufactured drama, between requests that deserve immediate attention and demands that can wait for more appropriate timing. This temporal sovereignty manifests as an almost ritualistic approach to their days and seasons. They create containers of time for different aspects of their lives, time for solitude and reflection, time for creative work, time for relationship and community, time for rest and renewal. These containers are not rigid, but they are real, offering structure that supports rather than constrains their authentic expression. In their interactions with others, this temporal sovereignty creates a quality of unhurried presence that is itself a form of dominance. While others rush frantically from commitment to commitment, reactive to every demand placed upon them, the quietly dominant move through their days with deliberate pace and conscious intention. Their refusal to be hurried paradoxically makes others slow down in their presence, creating space for more meaningful connection and communication. The mastery of sacred boundaries ultimately reveals itself as a form of spiritual practice, an ongoing discipline of honoring the temple of the self while remaining open to authentic communion with others. It requires constant refinement, moment-by-moment choices between different possible responses, the willingness to disappoint others in service of deeper integrity. This practice creates what we might call energetic authority, a presence that communicates its own limits without explanation or justification. Others sense these boundaries not as rejection but as invitation to relate more authentically themselves. In the presence of clear boundaries, people often find permission to discover and express their own limits, their own authentic no's and enthusiastic yeses. The energetic field created by sacred boundaries also serves a protective function for others. Like the banks of a river that allow the water to flow more powerfully and purposefully, appropriate boundaries create container within which intimacy can deepen safely. Others sense that they will not be invaded, engulfed, or lost in relationship with this person, and this safety allows them to risk greater vulnerability and authenticity. In the end, the art of sacred boundaries reveals itself as one of the most practical expressions of psychological maturity. It demonstrates that true strength lies not in the ability to endure unlimited demands, but in the wisdom to recognize which demands serve our highest purposes and which deplete our vital resources. It shows that authentic generosity flows not from compulsion but from choice, not from guilt but from love. The quietly dominant, through their mastery of sacred boundaries, become what Jung called individuated personalities, whole beings who have learned to honor both their own needs and others' autonomy, both their capacity for connection and their requirement for solitude, both their gifts to offer and their limits to respect. They stand as living demonstrations that it is possible to be both strong and tender, both open and protected, both generous and self-caring. In a world where boundary violations have become normalized, where taking advantage of others' generosity is often seen as cleverness rather than violation, the quietly dominant offer a different model entirely. They show us that boundaries need not be walls, but can be gardens, carefully tended spaces where authentic life can flourish, protected from the chaos and confusion that characterize so much of modern existence. Their example invites us all into greater consciousness about our own energetic ecology, our own sacred precincts, our own requirements for maintaining the temple of the self, while remaining available for genuine service to the larger community of souls, seeking their way home to themselves. In the vast theater of human existence, where billions of souls perform their daily dramas of identity and belonging, there emerges occasionally a figure who moves through the world with a quality so rare it stops others in their tracks. They are not performing authenticity, they are being it. In a world saturated with manufactured personas and calculated presentations of self, genuine authenticity becomes as magnetic as a flame in the darkness, drawing others like moths who have forgotten what real fire looks like. This magnetism of authentic being represents perhaps the most mysterious and powerful form of influence available to human consciousness. It operates not through what Jung called the persona, that carefully crafted mask we wear in social situations, but through what he termed the self, that deeper center of personality that transcends ego consciousness and connects us to the archetypal depths of being. When someone learns to live from this deeper center, they emit what we might call an authenticity field, an energetic signature that others recognize immediately, even if they cannot name what they are sensing. To understand this magnetism, we must first examine what has happened to authenticity in our modern world. We live in what Jung presciently recognized as the age of mass psychology, where individual consciousness is constantly threatened by collective pressures toward conformity. The demands of social media, corporate culture, and consumer society create a relentless pressure to present curated versions of ourselves, highlight reels designed to win approval, generate envy, or avoid criticism. Most souls succumb to these pressures, gradually losing touch with their authentic core as they perfect their performances of acceptability. They learn to speak in the approved vocabularies of their tribes, to express only those emotions deemed appropriate by their communities, to pursue only those dreams that align with external expectations of success and happiness. Layer by layer, the authentic self becomes buried beneath accumulated sediment of conditioning, adaptation, and compromise. But the process of individuation, that central task of human development, that Jung saw as the purpose of the second half of life, demands something radically different. It requires what we might call the archaeological excavation of the authentic self, a careful digging through the layers of conditioning to rediscover what was genuine and vital before it was shaped by others' expectations and limitations. This excavation is not a return to some romanticized state of natural innocence. We cannot simply strip away socialization and return to some pre-civilized authenticity. Rather, it requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold conscious and unconscious contents in creative tension until something new emerges. True authenticity is not the raw expression of every impulse and emotion, but the conscious choice to embody one's deepest values and truest nature, even when doing so conflicts with social convenience or approval. The journey toward authentic being typically begins with what Jung called the call to individuation, some crisis or disruption that shatters the ego's comfortable identifications and forces a deeper reckoning with questions of meaning and purpose. This might come through loss, failure, illness, or simply the accumulating weight of living a life that feels increasingly hollow and performative. The ego experiences this call as death itself, for in some sense it is the false self must die for the authentic self to be born. This death is rarely dramatic or sudden. More often it unfolds as a gradual disillusionment with the rewards and recognitions that once motivated us, the promotions that no longer satisfy, the relationships that feel increasingly superficial, the achievements that leave us strangely empty. Slowly, we begin to question the very foundations upon which we have built our sense of identity and worth. The emergence from this dark night of the soul requires tremendous courage, the courage to disappoint others' expectations, to risk rejection and misunderstanding, to choose truth over comfort. It demands what we might call the radical act of self-ownership, the claiming of our own experience as valid and valuable, regardless of others' opinions or judgments about it. This self-ownership manifests first as a growing intolerance for pretense, both in ourselves and others. The authentically developing soul finds it increasingly difficult to engage in small talk, social performances, and the countless daily compromises that lubricate social interaction but sacrifice genuine connection. They begin to experience what Jung called the transcendence of the social personality, a movement beyond the need to be liked, approved of, or accepted by everyone. This transcendence is not antisocial, but transsocial. It represents the movement from external validation to internal authorization, from conformity to what others expect to alignment with what the soul knows to be true. The authentic person has learned to locate their center of gravity within themselves rather than in others' responses to them. This creates a stability and self-possession that others immediately recognize as genuine power. The magnetism that emerges from this process operates through what we might call morphic resonance, the mysterious tendency for authentic patterns to replicate themselves across space and time. When someone embodies genuine authenticity, they activate in others a deep remembering of their own authentic nature, like a tuning fork that causes other tuning forks of the same frequency to vibrate in sympathy. Authentic being awakens authenticity in those who encounter it. This resonance occurs below the threshold of conscious awareness, in what Jung called the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche we all share, populated by archetypal patterns and primordial memories. Authentic being activates what we might call the archetypal template of the true self, that innate pattern within each soul that knows what genuine humanity looks like and longs to express it. But this magnetism is not indiscriminate. Authentic being tends to attract those who are ready for deeper levels of truth and connection, while naturally repelling those who are invested in maintaining superficial or manipulative patterns of relationship. This selective attraction serves a protective function, creating around the authentic person a field of like-minded souls who support and encourage continued growth, rather than demanding conformity to collective mediocrity. The process of becoming authentic also requires what Jung called the integration of the inferior function, that least developed aspect of our psychological typology, that often carries tremendous creative potential. The thinking type must learn to honor feeling. The intuitive must ground their visions in practical reality. The extrovert must discover the richness of inner life. The introvert must learn to engage authentically with the outer world. This integration of the inferior function adds depth and complexity to authentic being. It prevents the common mistake of authenticity becoming simply another form of identification, this time with our most developed qualities rather than with social expectations. True authenticity includes and transcends all aspects of our nature, creating what Jung called the quaternity, a balanced expression of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. The magnetic quality of authentic being also stems from its rarity in our current cultural moment. In a world where most people are performing versions of themselves calculated to win approval or avoid criticism, encountering someone who simply is what they are creates a profound sense of relief and recognition. It reminds others of what they themselves could be if they had the courage to release their own performances and embrace their genuine nature. This reminder often creates what Jung called constellation of the self archetype, a spontaneous activation of others' own individuation process. In the presence of authentic being, people often find themselves spontaneously dropping masks they didn't even realize they were wearing. They discover permission to be more honest, more vulnerable, more genuinely themselves than they typically allow. The authentic person becomes what we might call a permission field, a living demonstration that it is possible to be oneself without apology or explanation. Their very existence challenges others to examine their own compromises and accommodations, their own betrayals of their deeper nature in service of external approval. But this permission field can also trigger what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological contents to transform into their opposites when taken to extremes. Some people respond to authentic being not with recognition and gratitude, but with resentment and attack. The authentic person's refusal to perform expected roles can be experienced as judgment or abandonment by those who have invested heavily in maintaining those very performances. This dynamic requires the authentic person to develop what we might call compassionate detachment, the ability to remain centered in their own truth while allowing others to have their own responses without taking responsibility for managing or fixing those responses. They learn to offer their authenticity as a gift, while remaining unattached to how that gift is received or whether it is accepted. The magnetism of authentic being also operates through what we might call energetic coherence, the alignment between inner truth and outer expression that creates a sense of wholeness and integration that others can feel even if they cannot name it. When someone's words, actions, and presence all emerge from the same authentic source, they emit what we might call a unified field, an energetic signature that registers as trustworthy, reliable, and genuine at levels below conscious awareness. This coherence stands in stark contrast to the energetic fragmentation that characterizes most human presentation. Most people speak from one part of themselves while feeling something different in their bodies and thinking yet something else in their minds. This fragmentation creates what we might call energetic static, a sense that something is off, that the person is not quite who they are presenting themselves to be. Authentic being eliminates this static through the integration of personality around a core of genuine self-knowledge. When someone knows who they are and has the courage to be it consistently, they become what Jung called a symbol of the self, a living demonstration of psychological wholeness that activates healing and integration in others, simply through proximity. The development of authentic being also requires what we might call the courage of imperfection, the willingness to be seen as flawed, limited, and human rather than maintaining perfect facades that hide our struggles and vulnerabilities. This courage paradoxically makes us more attractive rather than less, for others sense in our admitted humanity a safety and permission they rarely encounter in a world of manufactured perfection. The authentic person has made peace with their own contradictions, their own shadow aspects, their own ongoing process of growth and development. They do not present themselves as finished products but as works in progress, as fellow travelers on the journey of becoming rather than gurus who have arrived at some final destination. This humility creates what we might call relational safety, the sense that others can be honest about their own struggles and limitations without fear of judgment or rejection. In the presence of someone who owns their own imperfections, others feel permission to drop their own performances of having it all together and connect from places of genuine vulnerability and truth. The magnetism of authentic being ultimately reveals itself as one of the most powerful forces for transformation available to human consciousness. It operates not through teaching or preaching, but through simple modeling, the living demonstration that it is possible to be genuinely oneself in a world that constantly pressures us toward conformity and compromise. In a culture increasingly characterized by what Jung called the loss of the soul, the disconnection from deeper sources of meaning and purpose, authentic being becomes a form of medicine for collective healing. Each person who commits to the difficult work of becoming genuinely themselves contributes to the restoration of what we might call the authentic field, a cultural atmosphere that supports and encourages genuine self-expression rather than punishing it. The quietly dominant understand this responsibility and embrace it, not as burden, but as calling. They recognize that their authenticity serves not only their own individuation, but the healing of the larger community of souls, seeking their way back to their own genuine nature. In choosing to be themselves fully and without apology, they become magnetic centers of possibility, drawing others into the remembrance of their own authentic potential. This is perhaps the deepest secret of their quiet dominance. They do not seek to control or influence others, but their very being creates fields of permission and possibility that allow others to discover and express their own authentic nature. In doing so, they become leaders in the truest sense, not through the imposition of their will, but through the inspiration of their example, not through force, but through the irresistible magnetism of a soul that has found its way home to itself and invites others to do the same. In the cacophony of modern existence, where noise has become the default soundtrack of human experience, there emerges a power so rare it strikes observers like lightning in a clear sky, the power of conscious stillness. This is not the stillness of the withdrawn or the passive, not the emptiness of those who have nothing to say, but the pregnant silence of those who have learned to hear the deeper currents beneath the surface chatter of ordinary consciousness. In this stillness lies a command more absolute than any shouted order, more compelling than any argument, more influential than any performance of power. The quietly dominant have discovered what the ancient wisdom traditions knew, but our restless age has forgotten, that in stillness dwells the source of all authentic action, that in silence lives the word that changes worlds, that in emptiness resides the fullness from which all creation springs. They have learned to inhabit what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to generate new possibilities through the creative tension between conscious and unconscious contents. This stillness is not a technique, but a state of being, not something one does, but something one becomes. It emerges from what Jung described as the circumambulation of the self, that slow, spiraling journey around the central mystery of one's own being, that characterizes the individuation process. Through years of inner work, through countless encounters with their own depths, the quietly dominant have arrived at what we might call the still point of consciousness, that place where the ego's frantic activity gives way to the self's profound peace. Watch the ordinary soul in motion. Notice how they fill every silence with words, every pause with movement, every moment of uncertainty with anxious activity. They seem driven by what Jung called the participation mystique, that unconscious identification with external events that keeps them in constant reaction to their environment. They cannot be still because they have not yet learned to differentiate between themselves and the world around them, between their authentic responses and the automatic patterns that govern their behavior. But the still presence that characterizes quiet dominance emerges from a radically different orientation to existence. These individuals have undergone what the mystics called the Great Turning, a fundamental shift from living on the circumference of experience to dwelling at its center. They have learned to locate their identity not in what happens to them but in their response to what happens, not in the content of their experience, but in the consciousness that experiences it. This shift creates what we might call ontological stillness, a quality of being that remains unchanged regardless of external circumstances, like the eye of a hurricane which remains perfectly calm while chaos whirls around it. The still center of consciousness maintains its equanimity in the face of life's inevitable storms. This stillness is not indifference but presence, the capacity to be fully engaged with reality without being overwhelmed or controlled by it. The development of this stillness requires what Jung called the transcendence of the opposites, the movement beyond the either-or thinking that characterizes ego consciousness toward the both-and awareness that marks psychological maturity. The still person has learned to hold contradictions without rushing to resolve them, to remain in questions without immediately seeking answers, to exist in the space between polarities without being torn apart by their tension. This capacity for holding paradox manifests as what we might call dynamic stillness, not the frozen immobility of the frightened or overwhelmed, but the alert calm of those who are ready to respond to whatever emerges without prejudging what that response should be. They embody what the Taoist sages called wu-wei, effortless action that flows from deep attunement to the natural order rather than from the ego's agenda for how things should unfold. In interpersonal dynamics, this stillness creates what Jung called a temenos, a sacred container within which transformation can occur. Others sense this quality of spaciousness and find themselves naturally slowing down, becoming more present, speaking more truthfully than they typically allow themselves. The still person becomes what we might call a silence catalyst, someone whose very presence invites others into deeper levels of authenticity and reflection. This invitation operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, through what Jung described as the contagious nature of archetypal energies. When someone embodies genuine stillness, they activate in others the archetype of the wise old man or woman, that figure who appears in myths and dreams as the keeper of ancient wisdom, the one who knows without needing to prove their knowledge, who guides without pushing, who influences through being rather than doing. The stillness that commands also emerges from what we might call metabolized suffering, the transformation of pain into wisdom through conscious engagement rather than unconscious reaction. The quietly dominant have typically endured significant challenges that force them into deeper relationship with their own depths. Through these trials, they have learned what Jung called the meaning of suffering, not that pain is good, but that conscious relationship to pain can become a source of strength and wisdom. This metabolized suffering creates a quality of gravitas that others immediately recognize. It is the weight of someone who has been tested by life and emerged not bitter but deepened, not hardened but refined. Their stillness carries the authority of lived experience, the credibility of one who has walked through darkness and found light not by avoiding the shadow, but by learning to dance with it. The silent authority of such individuals manifests in their capacity to remain centered when others become reactive, to maintain perspective when others lose themselves in details, to respond rather than react to challenging situations. They become what we might call stability anchors, fixed points around which others can orient themselves when the familiar landmarks of their world begin to shift. This stability is not rigidity, but flexibility, the deep-rootedness that allows the tree to bend with the storm without breaking. The still person has learned to identify with what Jung called the self rather than the ego, the deeper center of personality that remains constant while the ego's identifications and attachments constantly change. From this deeper center, they can meet whatever arises with equanimity and grace. The cultivation of commanding stillness also requires what we might call the discipline of non-reactivity, the practice of creating space between stimulus and response, between what happens and how we choose to engage with what happens. This discipline is not suppression or denial but conscious choice, the development of what Viktor Frankl called the space between stimulus and response, where our freedom and power actually reside. This space becomes larger and more accessible through what Jung called active imagination, the conscious dialogue with unconscious contents that allows us to process emotional material before it expresses itself as unconscious reaction. The still person has learned to feel their emotions fully without being possessed by them, to acknowledge their impulses without being driven by them, to experience intensity without losing their center. Their stillness creates what we might call a vacuum of leadership, an absence of ego-driven direction that others naturally rush to fill with their own projections and needs. But unlike the manipulative creation of artificial scarcity or mystery, this vacuum emerges naturally from the absence of agenda, from the willingness to let situations unfold according to their own inner logic, rather than forcing predetermined outcomes. This quality of non-directive influence represents perhaps the most sophisticated form of leadership available to human consciousness. It operates through what Lao Tzu called the power of the valley, the strength that comes from being empty, receptive, and yielding rather than full, aggressive, and demanding. The still leader draws others through attraction rather than coercion, through modeling rather than commanding, through being rather than doing. The silence of such individuals is pregnant with possibility rather than empty of content. It carries what Jung called numinous quality, that sense of encountering something sacred, meaningful, and transformative. Others sense in their silence not absence but presence, not withdrawal but engagement, at a deeper level than words can reach. This numinous silence activates what we might call the archetype of the oracle, that figure who appears throughout human history as the one who knows through direct communion with deeper sources of wisdom, rather than through rational analysis or accumulated information. The oracle's power lies not in what they say but in their capacity to create space for truth to emerge from unexpected sources. The still person has learned to trust what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious, that deeper intelligence that operates through symbols, dreams, synchronicities, and intuitive knowings rather than through logical deduction. They have developed what we might call receptive intelligence, the capacity to receive guidance from sources beyond ego consciousness and to act on that guidance with confidence and skill. In the end, the stillness that commands reveals itself as one of the most natural expressions of psychological maturity. It demonstrates that true power lies not in the ability to create noise and activity, but in the capacity to remain centered and present regardless of external circumstances. It shows that authentic influence flows not from the ego's need to control and manipulate, but from the self's natural authority and wisdom. The quietly dominant, through their mastery of conscious stillness, become what Jung called symbols of transformation, living demonstrations that it is possible to find peace in the midst of chaos, wisdom in the face of complexity, and authority that emerges from being rather than doing. They stand as reminders that in a world increasingly filled with noise and distraction, the greatest power may lie in learning once again how to be genuinely, consciously, and powerfully still. In the depths of the collective human psyche dwells an archetype as ancient as consciousness itself, the wounded healer, that paradoxical figure who transforms personal suffering into medicine for others, who finds in their own darkness the light that can illuminate others' paths. This archetype manifests most powerfully in those who dominate quietly, for they have learned the profound secret that Jung glimpsed in his own dark night of the soul, that our deepest wounds, when consciously engaged, become our greatest sources of healing power, not only for ourselves but for all who cross our paths. The wounded healer represents one of the most mysterious and potent forms of influence available to human consciousness. Unlike the authority of position or the power of persuasion, this influence operates in the realm of what Jung called the objective psyche, the transpersonal dimension of being where individual consciousness connects with the archetypal depths that govern human experience. The healer's influence flows not from their ego's intentions but from their very being, radiating outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. To understand this unconscious influence, we must first examine the alchemical process by which wounds become wisdom, by which personal suffering transforms into collective medicine. This transformation begins with what Jung called the encounter with the shadow, that confrontation with the rejected, denied, or unlived aspects of ourselves that life inevitably forces upon us through crisis, loss, failure, or illness. Most souls attempt to avoid this encounter, projecting their darkness onto others, numbing their pain through various forms of addiction or distraction, or maintaining elaborate defenses that keep them from feeling the full impact of their woundedness. But there are those who, by temperament or circumstance, find themselves unable to avoid the descent into their own underworld. These are the ones who become wounded healers, not by choice, but by necessity. The journey into the wound is never undertaken lightly. It requires what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the dissolution of everything that once seemed solid and reliable about one's identity and worldview. For the future healer, this often manifests as what Jung termed a creative illness, a period of psychological breakdown that paradoxically becomes the foundation for breakthrough into new levels of understanding and compassion. During this dark passage, the individual experiences what we might call the democratization of suffering, the recognition that their pain is not unique or special, but part of the universal human condition. This recognition, painful as it may be to the ego that prefers to see itself as exceptional, becomes the foundation for genuine empathy and healing power. The one who has touched the depths of human suffering can recognize those depths in others, not through projection or assumption, but through the deep knowing that comes from direct experience. The transformation of wound into wisdom occurs through what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to generate new possibilities through the conscious holding of opposites. The wounded healer learns to hold the tension between their pain and their wholeness, between their brokenness and their strength, between their personal suffering and their transpersonal purpose. This conscious holding creates a kind of alchemical vessel within which lead transforms into gold, where the base metal of unreflected suffering becomes the precious substance of conscious compassion. This transformation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process that deepens throughout the healer's lifetime. Each new encounter with suffering, their own or others, becomes an opportunity for further refinement of their healing capacity. They develop what we might call suffering literacy, the ability to read the language of pain, to understand its purposes and meanings, to recognize the difference between suffering that serves growth and suffering that perpetuates stagnation. The unconscious influence of the wounded healer operates through what Jung called constellation, the spontaneous activation of archetypal energies in response to the presence of someone who embodies a particular archetypal pattern. When others encounter a genuine wounded healer, they experience an unconscious recognition of possibility, the sense that healing is not only possible but inevitable, that wholeness can emerge from brokenness, that meaning can be found in the midst of meaninglessness. This constellation occurs below the threshold of rational awareness in what Jung called the participation mystique, that primitive psychological state where boundaries between self and other become permeable. In the presence of the wounded healer, others may find themselves spontaneously accessing their own capacity for healing, their own inner wisdom, their own ability to transform suffering into strength. The healer becomes what we might call a resonance chamber, a living demonstration that the very experiences that seem to destroy us can become the foundation for our greatest gifts. But this influence is not always comfortable or easy for those who receive it. The presence of the wounded healer can trigger what Jung called healing crises, periods of intensified symptoms, emotional upheaval, or psychological disruption. that paradoxically serve the healing process. The healer's very being can activate dormant potentials in others, bringing to the surface repressed material that needs to be consciously integrated for wholeness to emerge. This catalytic function requires tremendous responsibility and skill on the part of the healer. They must learn to distinguish between the suffering that serves growth and the suffering that indicates genuine pathology requiring professional intervention. They must develop what we might call therapeutic intuition, the ability to sense what others are ready to face and what would overwhelm their current capacity for integration. The wounded healer's influence also operates through what we might call energetic transmission, the non-verbal communication of emotional and spiritual states that occurs through proximity to someone who has achieved a particular quality of being. Research in neuroscience has begun to confirm what mystics have long known, that human nervous systems are far more interconnected than we typically realize, constantly influencing each other through subtle cues, pheromones, electromagnetic fields, and other channels of communication that operate below conscious awareness. The healer who has integrated their woundedness radiates what we might call a coherent field, an energetic signature that communicates safety, possibility, and hope to other nervous systems. This field operates like a tuning fork, causing others to resonate with frequencies of healing, wholeness, and integration that may have been dormant or inaccessible in their ordinary state of consciousness. This transmission occurs most powerfully through what Jung called active imagination, the capacity to engage consciously with the symbolic and imaginal dimensions of experience. The wounded healer has learned to dialogue with their own unconscious contents, their dreams, fantasies, symptoms, and spontaneous images, in ways that transform these contents from autonomous complexes into conscious allies. This skill creates what we might call imaginal literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language through which the psyche communicates its deepest needs and potentials. When others encounter this imaginal literacy, they often find their own symbolic life becoming more vivid and meaningful. Dreams become more memorable and relevant. Synchronicities increase in frequency and significance. The seemingly random events of daily life begin to reveal patterns and meanings that point toward healing and growth. The healer's presence activates what Jung called the self-healing capacity of the psyche, that innate tendency toward wholeness that exists within every human being, but often remains dormant until activated by the right catalyst. The wounded healer's influence also manifests through what we might call permission-giving, the unconscious communication that it is safe to feel deeply, to be vulnerable, to acknowledge one's wounds without shame or self-judgment. In a culture that often pathologizes emotional pain or rushes to medicate it away, the wounded healer stands as living proof that suffering can be faced, integrated, and transformed into wisdom and compassion. This permission operates through what Jung called the constellation of the self-archetype, the activation of that deeper center of personality that transcends ego consciousness and connects us to our highest potentials. In the presence of someone who has successfully navigated their own healing journey, others may find themselves spontaneously accessing resources and capacities they didn't know they possessed. The healer's unconscious influence also extends into what Jung called the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche that we all share, populated by archetypal patterns and primordial images. The wounded healer who has done their own deep work becomes what we might call a collective antenna, someone who can sense and respond to the deeper currents of collective suffering and healing that characterize their historical moment. This sensitivity to collective currents makes the wounded healer particularly effective in recognizing and addressing what Jung called the spirit of the times, those unconscious attitudes, beliefs, and patterns that shape the psychological climate of an era. They may find themselves drawn to work with issues that are just beginning to emerge into collective awareness, serving as early warning systems for psychological and spiritual challenges that will later become widespread. The development of this collective sensitivity requires what we might call ego deflation, the release of the personal ego's need to be special, important, or exceptional. The wounded healer must learn to serve as a vehicle for healing energies that are larger than their individual personality, to become what the mystics called a hollow flute, an instrument through which the divine breath can play its healing melodies. This ego deflation is often experienced initially as loss or defeat, the recognition that one's personal will and agenda are insufficient to create the changes one longs to see in the world. But this apparent defeat becomes the foundation for genuine power, the power that flows not from ego inflation but from alignment with archetypal energies that transcend individual consciousness. The wounded healer's influence also operates through what we might call witnessing presence, the capacity to be fully present with others' pain without trying to fix, change, or heal it through direct intervention. This witnessing is itself a form of healing, for it provides what many souls have never experienced, the sense of being truly seen and accepted in their struggle, without judgment or the pressure to be different than they are. This quality of witnessing emerges from the healer's own journey through suffering, their intimate familiarity with the landscape of pain that allows them to navigate others' darkness without becoming lost or overwhelmed. They have learned what Jung called the art of suffering, the capacity to be with pain in ways that honor its purpose and meaning rather than simply trying to eliminate it as quickly as possible. The unconscious influence of the wounded healer also manifests through what we might call field effects, changes in the psychological atmosphere that occur simply through their presence in a group, family, or community. They may find that their mere participation in a gathering shifts the quality of conversation toward greater depth and authenticity, that their presence somehow gives others permission to be more honest about their struggles and more open to transformation. These field effects operate through what Jung called psychic contagion, the unconscious transmission of psychological states between individuals who are in proximity to each other. The healer who has achieved a certain quality of integration and wholeness radiates these qualities in ways that activate similar potentials in others, creating what we might call healing epidemics, spontaneous outbreaks of psychological and spiritual growth that spread through communities like wildfire. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the wounded healer's unconscious influence lies in what Jung called the redemptive function, the capacity to transform not only individual suffering, but collective trauma through the conscious integration of archetypal energies. The healer who has successfully navigated their own dark night of the soul becomes a living demonstration that even the most devastating experiences can be transformed into sources of wisdom, compassion, and healing power. This redemptive function operates across generations, healing not only present wounds but ancestral patterns of trauma and dysfunction that have been passed down through family lines and cultural traditions. The wounded healer becomes what we might call a transgenerational catalyst, someone whose healing work creates ripple effects that extend both backward and forward in time, healing ancestors through forgiveness and gratitude while blessing descendants through the transformation of inherited patterns. In the end, the healer's unconscious influence reveals itself as one of the most powerful forms of quiet dominance available to human consciousness. It demonstrates that true leadership often emerges not from strength, but from the conscious integration of weakness, not from success, but from the transformation of failure, not from knowledge, but from the wisdom that emerges from the depths of lived experience. The wounded healer dominates quietly, because their authority comes not from external achievement, but from internal transformation, not from what they have accomplished, but from what they have survived and integrated. Their influence flows naturally from the depth of their being, touching others at levels where healing is most needed and most possible, catalyzing transformations that ripple outward through families, communities, and cultures in ways that extend far beyond their conscious intention or understanding. They stand as living proof that our greatest wounds can become our greatest gifts, that our deepest suffering can be transformed into our most powerful medicine, and that the very experiences that seem to break us can become the foundation for a wholeness more complete and authentic than anything we could have imagined from the safety of our original innocence. In the ancient schools of wisdom, the philosophers spoke of a supreme achievement of consciousness, the capacity to love without attachment, to care without possessing, to engage fully with life, while maintaining what Marcus Aurelius called the view from above. This paradoxical stance represents one of the highest expressions of psychological maturity, a way of being that the quietly dominant have discovered not through philosophical study, but through the hard-won wisdom of lived experience. They have learned to participate completely in the drama of existence while never losing sight of their role as witnesses to the eternal play of consciousness itself. This detached engagement emerges from what Jung called the individuation process, that lifelong journey of psychological development that moves us beyond the either-or thinking of ordinary consciousness toward the both and awareness that characterizes genuine wisdom. The individual who achieves this state has transcended what we might call the tyranny of outcomes, that exhausting attachment to results that keeps most souls in a state of chronic anxiety about whether their efforts will succeed or fail, whether their investments will pay off, whether their relationships will endure. The philosopher's detachment is not the cold withdrawal of those who have been wounded by life and choose safety over engagement, nor is it the spiritual bypassing of those who use detachment as an excuse to avoid responsibility and commitment. Rather, it is what the Stoics called amor fati, love of fate, the profound acceptance of life as it is while maintaining full engagement with life as it could become. This stance requires tremendous psychological sophistication, for it asks us to hold simultaneously our deepest caring and our ultimate letting go. The development of this capacity typically begins with what Jung termed the transcendence of the personal, a movement beyond the ego's narrow concerns toward identification with something larger and more enduring. This transcendence is often precipitated by crisis or loss that shatters the ego's comfortable assumptions about control and permanence. The individual discovers, often through painful experience, that their desperate attempts to control outcomes frequently produce the very results they were trying to avoid. This recognition initiates what we might call the great surrender, not the passive resignation of defeat, but the active choice to align with forces larger than individual will. The philosopher learns to distinguish between what the Stoics called things within our control and things beyond our control, focusing their energy entirely on the former, while maintaining equanimity about the latter. This focus creates what we might call strategic detachment, the ability to invest fully in process while remaining unattached to results. The detached engagement of the philosophical soul manifests most clearly in their approach to relationships. They love deeply, but without possessiveness, support others' growth, without trying to direct it, offer their gifts without demanding specific returns. This creates what Jung called a temenos, a sacred space where others can unfold according to their own inner nature, rather than according to external expectations or demands. This relational stance emerges from what we might call object constancy of the self, the recognition that one's essential nature remains intact regardless of others' responses or the outcomes of specific interactions. The philosopher has learned to locate their sense of worth and identity not in external validation, but in their capacity to remain true to their deepest values and commitments. This internal stability allows them to engage authentically without the desperate neediness that characterizes so much human interaction. The philosopher's detachment also extends to their relationship with their own thoughts and emotions. They have developed what Jung called the observing ego, that part of consciousness that can witness the arising and passing of psychological contents without being completely identified with them. They experience anger without becoming anger, feel sadness without drowning in despair, notice fear without being paralyzed by anxiety. This capacity for self-observation creates what we might call emotional sovereignty, the ability to choose their responses rather than being driven by automatic reactions. This emotional sovereignty manifests as an almost uncanny ability to remain centered in chaotic situations, to maintain perspective when others lose themselves in details, to respond rather than react to provocative circumstances. Others sense this stability and naturally gravitate toward it, finding in the philosopher's presence a refuge from the emotional storms that characterize so much of human experience. The philosophical stance also requires what we might call temporal detachment, the ability to hold long-term perspective while remaining fully present to immediate circumstances. The philosopher has learned to identify with what Jung called the eternal in man, that aspect of consciousness that transcends the temporal flux of birth and death, success and failure, pleasure and pain. From this eternal perspective, the inevitable ups and downs of human existence appear as variations in a larger symphony rather than as evidence of ultimate meaning or meaninglessness. This temporal detachment allows the philosopher to invest in projects and relationships that may not bear fruit for years or decades, to plant seeds whose harvest they may never see, to contribute to causes whose ultimate success or failure extends beyond their individual lifetime. They have learned what the Bhagavad Gita calls nishkama karma, action without attachment to the fruits of action, service offered for its own sake rather than for specific rewards. The philosopher's influence operates through what we might call presence rather than pressure, the creation of atmospheric conditions that support others' authentic development, rather than attempts to manipulate or control specific outcomes. They understand that genuine transformation cannot be forced but must emerge from within, that their role is to tend the garden of possibility rather than to manufacture specific flowers. This non-coercive influence manifests as what Lao Tzu called wo, effortless action that flows from deep alignment with natural principles rather than from the ego's agenda for how things should unfold. The philosopher has learned to cooperate with the deeper currents of life rather than swimming against them, to find the path of least resistance that paradoxically leads to greatest effectiveness. Their detached engagement also creates what we might call permission fields, energetic atmospheres where others feel safe to explore their own depths without judgment or premature advice. The philosopher's willingness to not know, to remain in questions rather than rushing to answers, gives others permission to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity rather than grasping for premature closure. This capacity for holding open space becomes itself a form of guidance and leadership. The development of philosophical detachment requires what Jung called the integration of the transcendent function, the capacity to hold conscious and unconscious contents in creative tension until new possibilities emerge. The philosopher has learned to live in what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without irritably reaching after fact and reason. This comfort with not knowing allows them to remain open to solutions and insights that would be invisible to more desperate or goal-oriented consciousness. This openness to the unknown manifests as what we might call receptive intelligence, the capacity to receive guidance from sources beyond rational calculation, while maintaining critical discernment about what is received. The philosopher has learned to trust what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious, while remaining grounded in practical reality and ethical responsibility. The philosopher's detached engagement also extends to their relationship with success and failure, pleasure and pain, praise and criticism. They have developed what the Stoics call the discipline of desire, the practice of wanting what happens rather than demanding that what they want should happen. This discipline is not passive acceptance, but active alignment with reality as it is, combined with skillful action toward reality as it could become. This alignment creates what we might call flow states of being, sustained periods of effortless effectiveness, where action emerges spontaneously from deep understanding rather than from force or strain. The philosopher moves through life like water flowing downhill, finding the natural channels that lead toward their destination, while adapting fluidly to obstacles and opportunities that arise along the way. Their influence becomes what we might call gravitational rather than magnetic, attracting others not through charismatic performance, but through the natural pull of integrated being. Like planets that orbit the sun not because it commands them to, but because its very existence creates the gravitational field that organizes their movement, others find themselves naturally orienting around the philosopher's centered presence. The philosopher's detached engagement ultimately reveals itself as a profound form of service to the collective evolution of consciousness, by demonstrating that it is possible to care deeply without being attached to outcomes, to love fully without possessing, to act decisively without being driven by results. They model a way of being that points toward the next stage of human psychological development. In a world increasingly characterized by what Jung called the neurosis of our time, the chronic anxiety that comes from identification with roles, achievements, and external circumstances, The philosopher stands as living proof that freedom is possible, that peace can coexist with engagement, that wisdom emerges not from having all the answers, but from learning to live gracefully with the questions that matter most. Their quiet dominance flows naturally from this philosophical stance, for others recognize in them a quality of being that transcends the ordinary fears and desires that drive most human behavior. They become what Jung called symbols of the self, living demonstrations of what human consciousness becomes when it achieves integration and wholeness, when it learns to participate fully in the dance of existence, while never forgetting that it is both dancer and witness, both actor and audience in the eternal theater of being. In the depths of human consciousness lies a way of knowing that transcends the linear processes of rational thought, a form of intelligence that operates through symbol and synchronicity, through dream and divination, through the mysterious channels that connect individual awareness to what Jung called the collective unconscious. This is the oracle's knowing, not the dramatic pronouncements of ancient priestesses in temple caves, but the quiet certainty that emerges when someone has learned to navigate by the deeper currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of ordinary experience. The quietly dominant often carry within their psychic constitution this oracular capacity, though they may be entirely unaware of its nature or operation. Their decisions seem to emerge from nowhere yet prove mysteriously prescient. Their insights cut through confusion with startling clarity. Their timing appears almost supernatural in its precision. Others, sensing this connection to deeper sources of wisdom, naturally defer to their judgment even when they cannot rationally explain why such deference feels so appropriate. This oracular knowing represents what Jung called the transcendent function in its most refined expression, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to generate solutions that transcend the limitations of conscious reasoning. Unlike the oracle of popular imagination who receives visions in dramatic states of possession, the modern oracle has learned to live in conscious relationship with unconscious wisdom, to dialogue with the depths rather than being overwhelmed by them. The development of oracular consciousness begins with what Jung termed the differentiation of the feeling function, not feeling as emotion but feeling as a sophisticated form of evaluation that operates through qualitative assessment rather than quantitative measurement. This function allows the oracle to sense the invisible relationships between seemingly unrelated phenomena, to recognize patterns that exist in the realm of meaning rather than in the realm of mechanical causation. Watch the oracle in operation. Notice how they seem to know things they couldn't possibly know through ordinary means. They sense the emotional undercurrents in group dynamics before they become visible. They recognize the deeper patterns in apparently random events. They perceive the potential consequences of decisions before those consequences have had time to manifest. This knowing operates through what we might call resonant perception, the capacity to feel into the archetypal dimensions of experience, where individual events reveal their connection to universal principles. This resonant perception requires what Jung called the suspension of the directed thinking function, the temporary setting aside of goal-oriented problem-solving consciousness in favor of what he termed fantasy thinking or undirected mental activity. In this state, the oracle becomes receptive to what we might call spontaneous cognition, insights that arise not through logical deduction but through sudden recognition, not through step-by-step analysis but through immediate apprehension of wholes. The cultivation of this receptive state requires tremendous psychological sophistication. The oracle must learn to distinguish between genuine intuitive knowing and wishful thinking, between authentic revelation and psychological projection, between transpersonal guidance and personal bias. This discernment develops slowly through what Jung called the empirical attitude, the careful observation of which insights prove accurate and helpful over time and which prove to be distortions of unconscious complexes. The oracle's knowing often manifests first through what Jung called anticipatory function, the uncanny ability to sense what is approaching before it becomes visible to ordinary perception. They may feel inexplicably restless before major life changes, experience unusual dreams before significant events, or find themselves spontaneously preparing for circumstances they have no rational reason to expect. This anticipatory capacity emerges from what we might call temporal permeability, the oracle's sensitivity to the flow of time as quality rather than mere quantity. This sensitivity to temporal quality allows the oracle to recognize what the Greeks called kairos, the pregnant moment, the qualitative time when conditions are ripe for particular actions or revelations, while others experience time as uniform duration. The oracle perceives its rhythms and seasons, its periods of expansion and contraction, its moments of opening and closing. They learn to act not according to external schedules, but according to these deeper temporal currents. The oracle's influence operates primarily through what we might call revelatory discourse, speech that illuminates hidden connections and deeper meanings rather than providing information or advice in the conventional sense. Their words carry what Jung called numinous quality, that sense of encountering something sacred and meaningful that transcends ordinary communication. Others often find that the oracle's seemingly casual observations trigger profound realizations or emotional releases that had been building unconsciously for long periods. This revelatory capacity emerges from the oracle's ability to access what Jung called archetypal material, those universal patterns and images that exist in the collective unconscious and provide the fundamental structures of human experience. The oracle has learned to recognize when individual situations are constellating particular archetypal patterns, allowing them to see beyond surface appearances to the deeper dramas being enacted. For example, they might recognize that someone's workplace difficulties are actually a manifestation of the father complex, the unconscious patterns inherited from early relationship with authority figures, or they might perceive that a relationship crisis is activating the anima projection, the unconscious casting of the idealized feminine onto an external partner. This archetypal literacy allows the oracle to address the deeper dimensions of situations that others experience only as confusing emotional reactions. The oracle's knowing also operates through what Jung called synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that reveal the hidden connections between inner psychological states and outer events. The oracle has developed what we might call synchronicity literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language through which the unconscious communicates with consciousness. They notice when certain symbols, numbers, animals, or phrases begin appearing repeatedly in their environment, recognizing these repetitions as communications from the deeper layers of the psyche. This synchronicity literacy extends to their perception of others' experiences as well. The oracle often serves as what we might call a synchronicity catalyst, someone whose presence seems to activate meaningful coincidences in others' lives. People frequently report that after spending time with the oracle, they begin experiencing unusual dreams, encountering helpful strangers, or receiving unexpected opportunities that address precisely the challenges they have been facing. The development of oracular consciousness also requires what Jung called the integration of the shadow, the conscious acknowledgement and inclusion of those aspects of personality that have been rejected or denied. The oracle must face their own capacity for error, self-deception and unconscious projection before they can serve as clear channels for transpersonal wisdom. This integration creates what we might call humble omniscience, the paradoxical state of knowing much while remaining acutely aware of how little one knows. This humility protects the oracle from what Jung called inflation, the unconscious identification with archetypal energies that can lead to grandiosity and loss of human perspective. The integrated oracle understands that they are not the source of the wisdom that flows through them, but merely its temporary vessel. This understanding allows them to remain grounded and relatable even while serving as conduits for transpersonal insight. The oracle's influence also manifests through what we might call evocative presence, the capacity to activate in others their own dormant intuitive abilities. In the oracle's presence, people often find themselves having insights they didn't know they possessed, making connections they had never noticed before, receiving guidance from their own unconscious depths. The oracle becomes what we might call an awakening catalyst, someone whose own development of intuitive capacity creates permission and possibility for others to access their own inner knowing. This catalytic function operates through what Jung called the contagious nature of archetypal activation. When someone embodies a particular archetypal pattern with clarity and integration, they tend to activate that same pattern in others who are ready for its emergence. The oracle, having developed conscious relationship with the wise old man or wise old woman archetype, naturally evokes this figure in others unconscious, helping them access their own capacity for deeper knowing. The oracle's knowing also extends into what we might call collective currents, the deeper psychological movements that characterize particular historical periods or cultural moments. They may find themselves spontaneously drawn to explore themes, questions, or creative expressions that later prove to be emerging in the broader culture. This sensitivity to collective movements makes the oracle particularly valuable as what we might call an early warning system for psychological and spiritual challenges that will later become widespread. This collective sensitivity requires what Jung called participation mystique, a temporary dissolution of ego boundaries that allows the oracle to feel into the larger psychological field of which individual consciousness is merely a part. In this state, they may receive insights not only about their own path, but about the evolutionary direction of consciousness itself, the next stages of human psychological development, the emerging possibilities for collective healing and growth. The oracle's relationship to time also differs qualitatively from ordinary consciousness. They experience what we might call depth time awareness of the multiple layers of meaning and causation that exist within any given moment, while others experience events as discrete occurrences in linear sequence. The oracle perceives the eternal patterns that are being enacted through temporal circumstances, the mythic dimensions that give individual experiences their deeper significance. This perception of depth time allows the oracle to see beyond immediate appearances to the longer cycles and deeper purposes that govern human development. They may recognize that someone's current crisis is actually initiating them into a new phase of psychological growth, or that an apparent setback is positioning them for a breakthrough that couldn't have occurred any other way. This larger perspective makes the oracle particularly effective at helping others find meaning in difficult circumstances. The oracle's knowing also operates through what we might call symbolic literacy, the ability to read the metaphorical dimensions of experience where abstract principles take concrete form. They recognize that the events of outer life often mirror the movements of inner psychological development, that external circumstances frequently serve as perfect metaphors for internal processes that are seeking conscious recognition. For example, they might recognize that someone's car troubles are reflecting their need to examine their own motivation and direction in life, or that relationship conflicts are mirroring the internal tension between different aspects of personality that need to be integrated. This symbolic literacy allows the oracle to address root causes rather than merely symptoms, to work with a deeper intelligence that orchestrates external events in service of psychological growth. The cultivation of oracular consciousness also requires what Jung called active imagination, the conscious engagement with the spontaneous images, symbols, and narratives that arise from the unconscious. The oracle has learned to dialogue with their dreams, to follow their fantasies to their natural conclusions, to engage creatively with the figures and situations that emerge in meditation or contemplation. This practice develops what we might call imaginal literacy, fluency in the symbolic language, through which the psyche communicates its deepest wisdom. This imaginal literacy extends to the oracle's perception of others' psychological situations. They may spontaneously receive images or metaphors that illuminate someone's unconscious dynamics, or find themselves telling stories that perfectly capture the essential qualities of a particular life situation. This capacity to receive and transmit symbolic communication makes the oracle particularly effective at helping others understand their own psychological processes in ways that bypass rational resistance and speak directly to intuitive recognition. In the end, the oracle's intuitive knowing reveals itself as one of the most sophisticated expressions of human consciousness, the capacity to bridge the gap between individual awareness and universal wisdom, between temporal circumstances and eternal principles. between conscious intention and unconscious intelligence. The oracle demonstrates that it is possible to live in conscious relationship with the mystery that governs human existence, to receive guidance from sources beyond rational calculation, while remaining grounded in practical wisdom and ethical responsibility. Their quiet dominance emerges naturally from this connection to deeper sources of knowing. For others, recognize in them a quality of wisdom that transcends ordinary understanding. They become what Jung called mouthpieces of the divine, not through grandiose claims or dramatic performances, but through the simple embodiment of consciousness that has learned to listen to and speak from the depths of being itself. In a world increasingly characterized by information overload and analytical paralysis, the oracle offers something precious and rare, the demonstration that true knowing emerges not from accumulating more data, but from developing deeper sensitivity to the patterns and meanings that give data its significance. They remind us that within each soul lies an oracle waiting to be awakened, a capacity for wisdom that transcends the limitations of rational thought and connects us to the living intelligence that moves through all things. Beneath the chattering surface of conscious thought, where the ego builds its elaborate castles of reason and logic, there flows an ancient river of knowing that predates the birth of language itself. This is the realm of the oracle, the sacred territory where intuition dwells like a wise serpent coiled in the depths of the psyche, waiting to strike with lightning precision at the heart of truth. The quietly dominant have learned to drink from these primordial waters, to descend beneath the rational mind's restless waves into the profound stillness where wisdom crystallizes like salt from an evaporated sea. Here, in the submarine caverns of the unconscious, knowledge arrives not through the laborious process of deduction, but through sudden illumination, like dawn breaking over a landscape that was always there but hidden by the darkness of limited perception. Watch them in their moments of decision-making. These oracular beings who have learned to trust the deeper currents of knowing. They do not strain toward conclusions with the desperate effort of the purely rational mind. Instead, they grow still, allowing the surface turbulence of thought to settle until the clear bottom becomes visible. In this settling, this profound quieting of the mental waters, answers emerge like fish rising from the depths, silver-scaled and gleaming with an authority that needs no external validation. Their insights cut through the thick fog of confusion that surrounds most human dilemmas with the precision of a blade forged in some celestial smithy. Where others see only complexity, contradiction, and endless variables demanding careful analysis, the oracle perceives the simple pattern beneath, the golden thread that when pulled unravels the entire knot. This is not the crude simplification of the lazy mind, but the elegant simplicity that emerges on the far side of complexity, like a mountain peak that reveals itself only to those who have climbed through the confusing valleys and switchback trails of thorough understanding. Jung understood this phenomenon well, recognizing in the intuitive function something that transcends the ordinary boundaries of ego consciousness. He saw that true intuition represents a direct communication from the self, that deeper center of the psyche that holds the pattern of the whole and can therefore perceive relationships and possibilities invisible to the fragmentary perspective of the conscious mind. The oracle in this sense becomes a conduit for this deeper wisdom, a human antenna tuned to frequencies that most cannot hear. But this oracular knowing is not the province of mystical ecstasy or otherworldly dissociation. It emerges instead from a profound integration of the conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche, a marriage of above and below that creates a new kind of perception. The quietly dominant oracle has learned to honor both the discriminating power of consciousness and the receptive wisdom of the unconscious, creating within themselves a sacred vessel capable of holding and transmitting truths that emerge from their union. This process often appears mysterious to others, even supernatural in its seeming prescience. Decisions emerge from these oracular figures like fruit falling from a tree at the perfect moment of ripeness, without apparent effort or prolonged deliberation. Yet beneath this appearance of effortless knowing lies years of patient cultivation, decades of learning to trust the subtle signals that arise from the deeper layers of the psyche, the courage to act upon wisdom that cannot be fully explained to the rational mind. The authority that flows from such knowing is of an entirely different order than that which derives from accumulated facts or logical argument. It carries the weight of myth, the gravitational pull of archetypal truth. When the oracle speaks, others recognize something ancient and familiar, as if they are hearing their own deepest knowing reflected back to them through another's voice. This is why such insights command respect even from those who might resist more conventional forms of authority. In the realm of the oracle, timing becomes sacred art. Just as the ancient priestesses at Delphi spoke their prophecies when the spirit moved them, the quietly dominant oracle has learned to recognize the kairos moments when insight crystallizes and wisdom becomes ready for manifestation. They do not force these moments, but wait with the patience of the eternal, knowing that truth ripens according to its own mysterious schedule.